Welcome to the Socratic Inquiry Project, where we cut through the noise, challenge the narratives, and break down the facts that the mainstream media refuses to report honestly. Today, we're diving into one of the most blatant media manipulations in recent history, the so-called crackdown on pro-Palestinian student activists at Columbia University. You've probably seen the headlines: ICE arrests pro-Palestinian students, crackdown on free speech, Biden administration accused of silencing Palestinian voices. It sounds bad, right? But let me ask you this. What if I told you that these weren't just random students holding signs and chanting for Palestinian freedom? What if I told you they were actively supporting Hamas, a designated terrorist organization? We're talking about two individuals, Mahmoud Khalil and Leqaa Kordia, who weren't arrested for peaceful protest, weren't arrested for holding a Palestinian flag, and weren't arrested for saying Free Palestine. They were arrested because their actions directly aligned with Hamas propaganda and illegal material support for terrorism, something that, by law, is not protected under the First Amendment. And yet, what is the media telling you? That these students are just activists? That they were targeted for their beliefs? That this is about free speech? But let's be honest. Do you really believe for 1 second that if two students had been openly advocating for ISIS, the media would be calling them activists? Do you think they'd be described as victims of government oppression? Or would they be called what they actually are, pro-terrorist agitators? Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to lay out exactly who these students are, what they actually did, and why their actions weren't protected free speech, but a legal violation of federal anti-terrorism laws. Then we're going to dismantle the media's blatant manipulation, how they deliberately omit key facts to shape a false narrative. And finally, we're going to talk about why this matters, how tolerating this level of dishonesty and ideological corruption sets a dangerous precedent not just for politics, but for our entire society. Because let's be real, if we allow the media, politicians, and academic institutions to redefine terrorism as activism, then we've crossed a line that we might not be able to come back from. So let's get into it. Who were Mahmoud Khalil and Leqaa Kordia, and why were they arrested? So, who were these students? The media paints them as victims, as if they were just two peaceful demonstrators who got swept up in some government overreach. But let's actually look at the facts. Let's start with Mahmoud Khalil. He was a Columbia University graduate student, originally from Palestine, and a green card holder. He wasn't some undocumented immigrant hiding from ICE. He had legal residency in the US until, of course, the Department of Homeland Security arrested him for activities directly linked to Hamas propaganda. What was he doing? According to reports, Khalil wasn't just standing around holding a Free Palestine sign. He was actively distributing pro-Hamas flyers on Columbia's campus. These weren't just vague messages about Palestinian rights. These were direct endorsements of Hamas's violent actions. If that sounds extreme, it's because it is. This isn't speculation. The Department of Homeland Security and ICE have documentation on exactly what he was distributing. They allege that he was glorifying Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, the same attack where Hamas murdered civilians, raped women, and kidnapped children. Now, ask yourself this. What would happen if a student at Columbia started handing out flyers praising Al-Qaeda for 9/11, or ISIS for beheading American journalists? Would anyone be rushing to their defense, calling it protected speech? Of course not. They'd be arrested so fast you'd never hear their name again. But because this is Hamas, because the modern left has decided that Hamas is part of some noble resistance movement, suddenly we're supposed to pretend this is normal, that this is just free speech? No, this is material support for terrorism. Now let's talk about the second individual, Leqaa Kordia, a Palestinian student from the West Bank who was arrested for overstaying her student visa. And let's be clear, her visa wasn't revoked last week. It was revoked back in 2022 for lack of attendance. So, in reality, she was already illegally in the US when she got involved in these so-called protests. But here's where things get really interesting. Because Kordia wasn't just some passive supporter of Palestine. She was previously arrested for pro-Hamas activism in April 2024. Again, this isn't about someone waving a Palestinian flag. It's about direct involvement in pro-Hamas demonstrations that called for the destruction of Israel and praised terrorist attacks. Not just free Palestine, but long live Hamas. At what point do we stop pretending that this is some kind of misunderstanding? At what point do we stop acting like these are just innocent college students with strong opinions? Because this isn't about opinions. This is about law. Now, let's make one thing clear. The First Amendment does not protect what these students were doing. The law is very specific on this, and if the media were actually honest, they would acknowledge it. Let's examine the material support for terrorism, 18 U.S.C. 2339B law. This federal law makes it illegal to knowingly provide material support or resources to a designated foreign terrorist organization. And guess what? Hamas has been a designated terrorist group under U.S. law since 1997. What does material support mean? It doesn't just mean handing them weapons or money. It includes spreading propaganda, recruiting for them, and even just providing expert advice or assistance. So yes, distributing pro-Hamas flyers on a U.S. university campus? That qualifies. Now let's look at the idea of incitement to violence as determined in Brandenburg v. Ohio. The Supreme Court ruled that free speech is not protected if it incites imminent lawless action. If you're riling people up to support a terrorist organization, if your words are pushing people toward violence, that is not protected speech. If Trump can be accused of incitement for saying fight like hell on January 6th, then what do you call these students openly glorifying a terrorist attack? And before anyone accuses us of twisting things, let's be very clear. There is a difference between supporting Palestine and supporting Hamas. One is a cause, the other is a terrorist organization. You can believe in Palestinian self-determination. You can oppose Israel's policies. That's a conversation worth having. But when you cross the line into praising a group that slaughters civilians, kidnaps children and rapes women, you're not an activist. You're a terrorist sympathizer. So when people say they were just supporting Palestine, no, they weren't. They were supporting Hamas. And that is not protected speech. That is illegal. So now that we've established the facts, the real facts, why is the media hiding this? Why are they refusing to report what these students were actually doing? Why are they pretending this is about free speech when we all know it's about covering up ideological extremism? Stick with us, because in the next segment we're going to tear apart the media's blatant manipulation of this story and prove once again that they are lying to you. So now that we've established the facts, Mahmoud, Khalil and Leqaa Kordia were not just pro-Palestinian activists, but individuals who allegedly engaged in pro-Hamas advocacy, which is illegal under US law. Let's ask the next question. Why isn't the media reporting this honestly? Why do major news outlets keep using vague, sanitized language? Why do they leave out crucial details about actual material support for terrorism while framing these individuals as victims of government oppression? Well, let's take a look at the actual headlines and how they manipulate public perception. Here's a classic one from a mainstream outlet. ICE arrests pro-Palestinian Columbia students in shocking crackdown on activism. Sounds scary, right? A crackdown on activism. Like the government is just kicking down doors, snatching up students for holding a protest sign. But notice what's missing. There's no mention of Hamas, no mention of terrorist propaganda, no mention of previous arrests for pro-terror demonstrations. Now let's translate that same headline into reality. ICE arrests Columbia students for distributing Hamas propaganda and violating anti-terrorism laws. One version paints them as victims, the other tells the truth, and the media knows exactly what they're doing. Here's another trick they use: strategic omission. If you read the average news article about these arrests, you'll notice something strange. While they go on and on about how peaceful these students were, they completely ignore the fact that Khalil was distributing Hamas propaganda and that Kordia had already been arrested for similar activities. That's not an accident. That's by design. Because if they actually included those details, if they had to admit that these students could be directly involved in pro-terror activism, then the whole victim narrative falls apart. You see, the modern media doesn't just lie by what they say, they lie by what they refuse to say. And let's talk about the massive hypocrisy in all of this. Because we know, without a doubt, that if 2 Columbia students had been waving ISIS flags or chanting support for Al-Qaeda, this wouldn't even be a discussion. The same people defending Khalil and Kordia would be demanding their immediate deportation. Think about it. When conservatives peacefully protest, the media immediately paints them as dangerous or extremist. Remember when parents showed up at school board meetings to protest COVID policies and radical curriculum changes? The FBI labeled them as domestic terrorists. The media called them violent threats. Meanwhile, actual support for a terrorist organization. That's just activism. So let me ask you, where's the consistency? Where's the principle? If incitement to violence is such a serious issue when Trump tells people to fight like hell, then why is chanting support for Hamas suddenly free speech? Now at this point you might be wondering, why? Why does the media go out of its way to manipulate this story? Why do they insist on shielding pro-Hamas activists from scrutiny? Because this isn't just about one story. This is part of a larger ideological war being fought right in front of us. The left has embraced Hamas as part of a broader anti-colonial struggle. The narrative is that Israel equals the oppressor, and therefore anyone fighting Israel must be justified. It doesn't matter if that fight involves murdering civilians, taking hostages, or literally committing acts of genocide against Jews. Ideological loyalty is objective truth. The modern left isn't interested in facts or consistency. They need Hamas to be seen as freedom fighters, because if they actually acknowledged Hamas's atrocities, it would destroy their entire worldview. So here's the truth that no one in the corporate media will admit. Mahmoud, Khalil and Leqaa Kordia were not victims of free speech suppression. They were arrested because they were materially supporting a terrorist organization. And the only reason this is controversial is because the media has decided to gaslight the public into believing that Hamas is something it's not. At some point, we have to ask ourselves, when do we stop tolerating this level of deception? When do we hold journalists accountable for deliberately misleading the public? Because make no mistake, this isn't bad reporting. This is intentional manipulation. The media is lying to you, and they're not even trying to hide it anymore. So we've covered who these students were and how the media is actively distorting the truth. But now let's get to the bigger question. Why does this matter? What happens when we allow ideological lies to override objective reality? Stick with us, because in the next segment, we're going to talk about the long-term consequences of this deception and why we cannot afford to stay silent. So we've covered who these students were, what they actually did, and how the media has blatantly lied to the public to push a false narrative. Now let's talk about the bigger picture, why this matters. Because this isn't just about 2 radicalized Columbia students. This is about the dangerous precedent we are setting by allowing terrorist sympathizers to operate freely while demonizing those who speak the truth. Let's break it down. Because if we let this continue unchecked, we are opening the door to something far worse than just media bias. First, let's talk about the normalization of extremism. Because what the media is doing here, by whitewashing Khalil and Kordia's pro-Hamas activities, is conditioning the public to believe that openly supporting a terrorist organization is just another political stance. Think about this. How many times have you seen mainstream journalists or liberal politicians talk about understanding Hamas? How many times have we heard phrases like, Hamas is the legitimate government of Gaza, or Hamas is fighting against oppression? Do we ever talk about Al-Qaeda like that? Do we ever talk about ISIS like that? No. Because those groups were never successfully rebranded as freedom fighters. But Hamas has managed to manipulate the left into excusing terrorism as a form of resistance. And that is insanely dangerous. And let's talk about another huge issue, the blatant hypocrisy in how free speech is enforced. Because we all know that if 2 Columbia students had been caught openly distributing ISIS propaganda, they would have been expelled immediately and arrested without controversy. No one would be rushing to their defense, claiming that this was about protecting their right to speak. And yet, here we are. Khalil and Kordia were doing the exact same thing, except instead of ISIS, they were supporting Hamas. And suddenly, we have to pretend like this is some kind of moral grey area? And let's not forget, the same people crying about free speech here are the ones who have spent years demanding censorship of conservatives, banning dissent, and silencing opposition. Did they defend free speech when conservatives were getting banned from social media? Did they defend free speech when parents at school board meetings were being labelled domestic terrorists? Did they defend free speech when journalists were censored for questioning COVID policies? No. They only believe in free speech when it protects their side. The moment someone says something they don't like, they demand bans, boycotts, and censorship. This isn't about free speech. This is about power. And let's not ignore the national security implications here, because the fact that pro-Hamas radicalization is being defended in our universities should send a chill down everyone's spine. This is the kind of rhetoric that breeds the next generation of extremists. This is how radicalization spreads, not just in war zones, but right here, in the heart of the Western world. It starts with sympathizing. Then, it turns into justifying. And before you know it, you have a group of people who genuinely believe that violence is the answer. Do you think it's an accident that so many of the young people chanting from the river to the sea on college campuses can't even explain what it means? They're not thinking critically. They've been manipulated, emotionally charged, and pushed into a movement they don't even understand. And guess what? The people pulling the strings know exactly what they're doing. So here's the big question. What do we do about it? Because complaining about it isn't enough. This problem is only going to get worse unless people start pushing back. First, call out the media. Every time you see an article that frames pro-Hamas extremism as activism, challenge it. Call it what it is. Because the only way to stop propaganda is to make people see it for what it is. Share real information. Post about it. Talk about it. Don't let them get away with rewriting reality. Second, hold institutions accountable. Universities have been letting this fester for years, and it's time for consequences. If a school allows students to openly support terrorism, it should be cut off from federal funding. And it's not just universities. Politicians defending these students need to be called out. If they're willing to go to bat for people who support terrorism, they shouldn't be in office. Period. And finally, we need to stop letting emotions override reality. It's okay to feel compassion for the Palestinian people. It's okay to want peace. But supporting Hamas is not supporting peace. It's supporting terrorism. We have to stop pretending that we can separate Hamas from the suffering of Palestinians. Hamas is the reason for Palestinian suffering. Hamas uses civilians as human shields. Hamas takes international aid and turns it into weapons. Hamas doesn't want peace, it wants endless war. So no, we are not going to sit here and let people pretend that defending Hamas is activism. It's not. It's apologism for terrorism. And the more we tolerate it, the worse it's going to get. And here's the bottom line. Mahmoud, Khalil and Leqaa Kordia were not victims. They were not peaceful activists. They were terrorist sympathizers who got caught. And the fact that our media and politicians are bending over backwards to defend them should terrify everyone. We live in a time where telling the truth is considered radical, where calling out terrorism is controversial, where supporting actual terrorists can be rebranded as activism. And if we don't fight back against this, we are going to lose everything. So don't let them lie to you. Don't let them rewrite reality. Demand truth, demand accountability, and never let propaganda go unchallenged. We've spent this episode exposing media deception, breaking down Khalil's actions and challenging the narrative that this is just about free speech. But before we close, we need to do what neither the media nor the government is doing: question ourselves. Because the moment we stop challenging our own assumptions, we become just another ideological mouthpiece, and the world has enough of those. So, let's ask ourselves the hardest question of all. Did Mahmoud Khalil deserve to be deported? Even if we ignore the pro-Hamas flyer allegation, Khalil wasn't just a protester, he was a leader of a student organization that illegally broke into an occupied university property. A leader of a group that aligned itself with people who openly celebrated Hamas's October 7th attack on civilians. A leader who made no effort to separate legitimate Palestinian advocacy from extremists, and who showed no regard for the Jewish students on campus who felt threatened by their actions. At best, he was reckless. At worst, he was complicit in radical activism. And if we're honest, if a right-wing student group stormed a building, would the media be defending them? If pro-Israel students had illegally occupied a university space, would Columbia be silent? If these were conservatives breaking the law, would we be having this conversation? The moment you break into a building, the moment you take your activism beyond peaceful protest, it is no longer about free speech. But what if we're wrong? What if the government is overreaching? Where is the proof of the pro-Hamas flyers? If DHS has concrete evidence, why hasn't it been released? Does the US government now have the power to deport legal residents based on perceived national security risks rather than provable offences? If Khalil's actions were worthy of deportation, why is this standard not being applied to others? Because if we demand honesty from the media, we must also demand transparency from the government. If Khalil was distributing Hamas materials, show the evidence. If he wasn't, then the government has overstepped. And both of those outcomes matter. Because truth isn't about what's convenient, it's about what's real. The media refused to investigate Khalil's actual actions. They framed this purely as a free speech issue, ignoring the legal violations. They conveniently left out the radical elements within the student group. They treated the government's actions as inherently unjust without demanding real answers. But the government has failed too. They have not been fully transparent about why Khalil was deported. If the Hamas flyer claim is true, release the evidence. If they don't have strong proof, then they have overstepped their power. And if green card holders can now be deported based on perception rather than clear evidence, then where does it stop? So what needs to change? What does accountability actually look like? First, the media must stop shaping stories before the facts are clear. They need to recognize that activism is not above the law, and they need to hold the government accountable without shielding activists from consequences. Second, the government needs to prove its case. If Khalil was distributing Hamas propaganda, release the evidence. If his deportation was justified, apply the same standard elsewhere. And if we're expanding what qualifies as a national security risk, make that policy clear. Both sides have failed. The media refuses to inform. The government refuses to fully justify its actions. And in the middle of this mess, the truth gets lost. This is where we stand. We believe Khalil and his group crossed the line from protest into criminal activity. We believe the media is deliberately covering up the full story. But we also believe that if the government is using national security as its justification, then it owes the public full transparency. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is truth. Not ideology, not bias, not political convenience, just the reality of what happened. If the truth vindicates the government, so be it. If it exposes government overreach, so be it. But we will not settle for half-truths from either side. We demand accountability from the media. We demand accountability from the government. And most of all, we demand the full story, not just the parts that fit an agenda. Because if we don't demand the truth, we will never get it. This has been the Socratic Inquiry Project. Think for yourself, question everything, and never let anyone decide reality for you.